Joining me in the studio now, a man who has just written a book called The Australian Century. His name is Asher Judah. Asher, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now, tell us about your book. When you talk about the Australian century, I assume we're talking about the century ahead, not the century that's already gone?
That's right. It's all about Australia's next 90 years. And what I wanted to do was outline a vision for our country which was positive, engaging, uplifting, and also provided a roadmap for our leaders to take us down.
Well, I'll tell you what, our leaders seem very good at governing without any sense of a roadmap, so this is a good idea. All right, now, I understand, for example, I've had a look through the book and I've been sent some information on it by you, but one of the things that really caught my eye was you suggested introducing a statutory migration authority to set immigration policy. Tell us about that.
Well, look, immigration policy is a key part of our labour and economic architecture in this country. And in 2008, we were bringing in well over 350,000 people a year through our migration regime.
Yep.
And within 2 years, we dropped that down to 170,000 people a year. Now, the reason we did that is because there was community angst about the speed and the number, and there wasn't actually a long-term strategy behind our migration. And I think, like monetary policy, how we set our interest rates, we need a non-political entity to determine what is the best immigration level for our economy and then to set that policy.
I've long held a view that there should be a type of referendum on Australia's population. Like, should we grow fast, grow slow, not grow at all? Because we can choose. We're one of the few continents on Earth or countries on Earth that has the ability to control the number of people that come here. Do you have a personal view on how big Australia should be?
Well, I believe it constantly changes as technology and social structures evolve. If you'd visited Australia 150 years ago, you would have said, well, we probably only handle a couple million people because it was dry, barren, we didn't have electricity or refrigeration. But fast forward to today, and we do have those technologies. We have Wi-Fi, we have nuclear power, we have a wide range of...
well, we don't have nuclear power here, though, do we?
We have the capacity for it one day, you're right. And so what happened in between that 150 years is those technological changes have allowed us to increase the carrying capacity of our continent. And I think today we could easily handle 10 or 20 million more, but in 50 years, who knows what technology will make possible for our continent and for our living standards.
Well, chances are, of course, the technology will enhance our carrying capacity because we tend to go forwards, not backwards.
That's right.
Tony Taddeo, our newsreader, just said to me in passing a few minutes ago that he thinks Australia should have 50 million people. Now, I'm probably a bit more conservative. I think maybe 30, 35, at most a 50% increase on where we are now. But why don't politicians ever ask people, like all of us, how many people we would like to have here? Melbourne's currently got 4.5 odd million people. Maybe it should have 6, 7 or 8. I don't know. But people, I think, can comprehend cities and so forth in those terms. Why doesn't anybody ask us?
Well, I think politicians tend to ask questions they know the answer to in terms of the community, so then they can reflect that in their own opinions. I think we are different to other countries in the world with our carrying capacity. Australians are urban, very urban focused, and so they're likely to settle in our 5 or 6 major cities. So they are going to grow if we're going to have a population of 50 million. That is where the bulk of the people will be. I think the challenge is for government is to redesign how we manage population growth, how we manage urban development, so that we're better able to cope with a larger population. We haven't done that particularly well.
No, because it seems to me that state governments are the ones who often have to build the infrastructure. They have no control over how many people come into Australia. And all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, our freeway system doesn't connect, we don't have enough trams, etc., etc. Melbourne has grown substantially bigger within 20 years. And there appears to be this disconnect between the people who make the decision to let in more immigrants or have a bigger population and those who have to build the infrastructure that's needed for them.
That's right. And look, in my book, I do talk about partially devolving migration powers back to the states. I do that. I talk about that not because I think state government should determine the immigration policy of the country, but if Melbourne and Sydney want to slow down growth to catch up with infrastructure, they should have a hand on one of the brakes.
Well, straight after World War II, I remember if you read Neville Shute's book, The High Country, and it was about a Czech doctor who was forced to settle around Mansfield. Back then we had no problem with telling European migrants, look, you need to go and live here. And, here might be out in the middle of the country or wherever, and that's where you have to live for 4 or 5 years. And that actually, they often sent them or tried to send them to places where they thought there was a labour shortage. Now, maybe that was ham-fisted, but it sort of tried to move immigrants to the parts of the country that might actually need them at that time.
Well, I think we should explore that today. I think there's nothing wrong with putting a few restrictions on labour movements based on immigration policy. We already have those in place for different levels of migration, for skilled migration in regards to the mining industry. I think the mistake we've made is we've looked at our country as a continent, when in fact we are a collection of dislocated islands. And as a result, what is needed in Broome has nothing to do with what is needed in Melbourne.
And when you say islands, I mean, we are a continent, but you're saying you got your Melbourne, which is a big city, and then you got nothing or not much, and Sydney and then Brisbane, but with often thousands of kilometres of not much in between.
That's right. If you ran a train line from Melbourne to Sydney, you'd probably pick up 12 million people. And 95% of that would be in Melbourne or Sydney. But if you ran the same train line of similar distance from Chicago to Toronto or from Boston to Washington, you'll pick up between 50 and 70 million people.
Which is probably the reason we don't ever or have never had a very fast train between these cities.
That's right. But that's why America is more like a continental nation. We're like a series of islands. Our urban centres are our islands, and they are nowhere near each other.
All right, we'll go to calls in a moment. Asher Judah is with me, author of The Australian Century, trying to make sense of Australia's place in the world over the next 90 years, the 21st century. 96900 693 13 13 32. Your calls for Asher Judah coming up. It's 16 to 4. Okay, by the end of this century, the 21st century, what will Australian look like? My guest, Asher Judah, has had a stab at it. Just before we go to calls, 96900 693. A lot of people have said that, the 21st century is and will remain the Asian century. And of course, politicians going back to Paul Keating said that Australia was, essentially part of Asia. What are your thoughts on that, Asher?
Well, I think geographically we're obviously a part of this, the Asian part of the world. Culturally, I don't think there's a strong argument to say that that's the case. But I think when we talk about our future, we need to start looking at ourselves as a supporting actor in someone else's drama. We need to write our own story and make ourselves the lead actor.
But what is that drama? What is the lead actor, if you like, that we are supporting?
Well, in the Asian Century White Paper, for example, it's about the growth of Asia and how we can sort of fit into that drama. My book talks about the Australian century and how we write our own script about where we want to go and how the rest of the world will interact with us as a result.
I mean, so for example, the 20th century, it was probably best described as the American century. After the first half of the century, America emerged as one of two superpowers. A lot is written about America's power declining. Do you think by the end of the 21st century, America will still be a big, important nation?
I do. I'm pretty bullish about America's long-term prospects. I don't see any alternative power rising up to challenge them effectively. In my book, I talk about China and India and their long-term prospects. I'm quite doubtful about their ability to transition from basically very poor, very large developing countries to highly sophisticated, and developed and wealthy established countries. It's a very difficult path, and they've got a very long way to go. Let's go
to some calls. 96900 693. Fred, good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you for taking my call.
Pleasure.
The reason why the politicians don't ask the public about what sort of population we should have is because they're scared they're going to say we've got too many people already, because they value the quality of life and what we have here, and they don't want just more people. And the argument that we need more people to grow business is just of no interest to them. So they're scared of the answer.
Is that what you think, Fred?
Yes. This is the impression I get from everyone I talk to, because they value the openness, the space. They value not running into just people everywhere they go, and they don't want to be like the rest of the world.
All right, thank you, Fred. Asher, what do you reckon? I mean, if the Australian people were asked, and we could have a referendum on this, do you reckon people would vote for a bigger, smaller, substantially bigger population?
Look, I think at the moment it would probably be line ball. There are a lot of people who can see a larger Australia being in our interest, and others would say, no, look, not for me. I'm sick of getting stuck in traffic, can't get my kid into school. But I think it requires community leaders to actually make the argument for a bigger country, and I don't think there's enough of them present at the moment. Look, I understand why people are apprehensive about a larger population, but the reality is our standard of living will decline if we don't continue to grow. Our entire economy is based on more consumers, a higher demand for products that we produce and services that we provide. And as our population ages, we're going to need more people to look after our elderly. Now, if for example, you're 45 or 50 today, in 25 years, Australia's workforce won't be growing anymore. And if you want someone to be at home caring for you, mowing your lawns, doing your laundry, perhaps doing a bit of nursing around the house to help you and your husband or wife, you're going to need people to do that. And if we don't have enough people in the workforce, you're going to go without that support.
Paul, good afternoon.
Yeah, look, I mean, I go to shopping centres. I can't even get a car park, right? At Northlands, I took half an hour just yesterday to get a car park. And look, do we want Australia to be like the rest of the world? I mean, why don't we leave it the way it is? There's enough people, people here, and people that can't even speak English and communicate. So I don't think we need more people here.
Paul, you weren't tempted to park in a disabled parking spot, were you?
Never. I'd never do that. I would never do that. But you can't get a car park. Everything seems to takes longer now. Australia's not what it was. It's not the country that we make it out to be overseas to visitors, because it's starting to get really congested, I think.
Thank you, Paul. Asher, Paul, just a point he made. I mean, what about speaking English? I remember having a chat with an American who said America used to be great when, everybody left their previous cultural baggage at the door when they arrived, and that they got here being America, worked hard and learnt to speak English. Now, arguably since the 70s, we don't make it a requirement for people to learn English. Do you think having a common language is important for a nation like ours?
I think it is. Look, I'm the son of an immigrant. So I speak in terms of that sort of background. My father spoke 5 different languages, came here speaking English, so he was able to adapt to Australia quite quickly. But look, I think people need to remember that this isn't the 1950s anymore, where you could come to Australia and find a low-skilled job and raise your family and be successful without a good grasp of English. If you want to sign an employment contract, you need to be able to read English. If you want to drive down the streets, you need to be able to read the road signs, which are in English. If you want to be a taxi driver, you need to know how to read English and communicate to your customers. So the idea that you can function in Australia today with computers and voting and street signs and contracts without having a working command of the English language is no longer realistic. They'll end up in the lowest paid jobs, possibly exploited. And I don't think that we want that for our immigrants. We want them to become the best that they can be, and English is often the tool to do that.
Are you saying that taxi drivers should actually know where they're going and know the shortest route between 2 points on a map?
Yes, in my book I advocate that kind of revolutionary thinking. Look, taxi drivers do their best. They're not well paid, and I understand the challenges that they face. But the reality is English opens doors in Australia, and it always will.
We'll go back to some more calls in a moment with Asher Judah, author of The Australian Century. It's 7 to 4. It is 3 to 4, the Drive program brought to you for Channel 10. Family Feud is bringing fun to 6 o'clock weeknights. Join Grant Denyer, 6 o'clock tonight on 10. And breaking news and sad news, in the Latrobe Valley, 100 jobs have just been lost. The Morwell briquette factory and the power station that fuels it is being closed. 100 jobs lost in the Latrobe Valley. Asher Judah is with me, author of a book called The Australian Century. Anthony, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My concern is that if that we're picking a figure of about, say, 50 million, between 30 and 50 million, you're going to have to look at Sydney becoming a megapolis, becoming, say, over 10 million people, probably Melbourne becoming the size of Sydney now.
Yep.
Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide now go to 3 and 4 million people, as well as you might need more cities in over the next 50 years. With that, you then have to look at the most basic thing you need, and that's water.
All right, thank you, Anthony. I'm not sure if it was clear, Asher, but Anthony says that water is a big issue, and we learnt that in the drought several years ago. Do you think that we have enough water to carry 50 million people on this land?
Absolutely.
We do?
I think the mistake we've made in the water debate is focusing on rainfall during a drought and not actually about the infrastructure necessary to capture the rainfall and the stream runoff that we have. I mean, statistically, Sydney, Melbourne and Perth, for example, receive more rainfall than London. Now, London's a very big city, and the reason they have no water problems is because they've got the infrastructure in place.
And they recycle it. Now, very quickly, we spoke about symbolism or potential symbolism for a new Australian flag if the Union Jack bites the dust. Have you had any thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the great symbols of Australia, and maybe it won't fit quite on the flag, but it's a symbol I think that's unique, is the suburbs. Australia builds suburbs. It's one of our great cultural icons. It's mowing the lawn, it's water fights, it's street cricket, it's backyard footy. Most countries in the world can't even imagine
There
a
you go.
lifestyle like that. So
A
I
Hills
think-
hoist or maybe a Victor lawnmower on the Australian flag.
Well, they're unique cultural traits to Australia, and we should be proud of them.
All right, I think it's a very good idea. The Hills hoist, the Victor lawnmower, would you use them to replace the Union Jack? Thank you very much, Asher Judah. News is next with Tony Tardio. Loads more calls after that. 96900 693 here on 3AW Drive.